Hi, it's Dr. Isom. I'm back to talk about some of the research methods that are used to associate personality traits and behavior. There are several ways that researchers study personality traits. The ones I'm going to talk about are the single trait approach, the many trait approach, and the essential trait approach. The first one is the single trait approach, and this is really straightforward. In the single trait approach, the question that researchers are asking is what behaviors go along with high and low levels of any given personality trait. So you measure a personality trait and then identify the behaviors that are correlated with that trait. Here's an example. Say that researchers wanted to know what kind of behaviors a person who is highly extroverted engages in. So you would measure extroversion. That is your single trait. And then you would research the types of behaviors that extroverts engage in. And so this research might identify that people who are high in the personality trait of extroversion love big parties, tend to have many friends, and prefer going out to staying in. This is an example of using the single trait approach to get a better understanding of what individuals who score highly in extroversion do. In this case, they examined the correlations between extroversion and behavior. Here's another example, and this is using conscientiousness. Studying conscientiousness using the single trait approach would just involve measuring the trait of conscientiousness and then determining which behaviors would be associated with high levels of conscientiousness. Now, this is often done if you've ever worked in retail. Sometimes you've had to take some sort of an assessment as part of your job interview. Those assessments are often integrity tests, and integrity tests are essentially measuring the 5-factor trait of conscientiousness. And the reason why is because single trait approach researchers have identified that those people who score highly in conscientiousness are also responsible, they're highly motivated, they're academically successful, they perform better on the job, and they live longer. So that's the ideal person that you'd want to have as an employee, which is one of the reasons why they are part of the job interview process. Here's another one. This is a trait called grit, and this is something that Angela Duckworth talks about. Grit is the tendency to sustain interest and effort in something that takes a long time to accomplish, even when it is really difficult and there are significant obstacles in the way, such as getting a college degree. How would you measure this? Well, you would measure the trait of grit. Angela Duckworth has a measure of trait grit. And then you would correlate the behaviors that are associated with high levels of grit, people who have higher levels of this trait. And what they found is that people who score highly on this trait have lower divorce rates. They recover better and faster when things go wrong, when things go bad in their lives. They tend to have high academic grades and later higher career success, and overall they're happier. So these are all behaviors that go along with people who score highly in this single trait of grit. One of the things that I hypothesize is that students at Fresno State probably score higher in grit than students at other universities, because our students at Fresno State often have other responsibilities in addition to school, including working, sometimes full-time, including taking care of families, including driving and commuting from faraway places in the valley just to be able to come to school. That takes a lot of grit. So these are all examples of the single trait approach, where you identify the trait that you want to know about, you measure it, and then you identify the behaviors that are correlated with people who score highly in that trait. The next approach is the many trait approach, and this is kind of the reverse. In this case, what you're doing is you're finding a behavior or a life outcome first, and then you're trying to understand what personality traits are associated with that life outcome. For example, let's say you want to know about soccer moms. What's the personality of soccer moms like? What you would do is you'd identify your life outcome, in this case, soccer moms, and then you would essentially measure their personality. In this case, using the many trait approach, it was determined that soccer moms tend to be politically conservative, more anxious, and more determined. So this is an example of using the many trait approach to get a better understanding of a behavior or a life outcome by measuring and determining the traits that are correlated with that life outcome. You could also do this with other behaviors or life outcomes, including hipsters or even school shooters. One of the ways that you can identify the traits that go along with that life outcome or behavior is by using the California Q Set. The California Q Set is a deck of 100 cards, and each card has a different trait. And the person who's asked to do the assessment has to sort the cards in a way that requires them to choose the cards that have traits that are the most descriptive of a person. It could be themselves if they're doing a self-report, or it could be about somebody else that they know, an informant report. They sort the cards that are most descriptive about that person. On one side, on the right side, most characteristic, they're only allowed to pick 3 cards out of the entire deck. And the cards that are the traits that are least characteristic about that person. All the way on the far right, you're only allowed to pick 3 cards that are the least characteristic. And then all the other cards have to be sorted in this organization from most characteristic to least characteristic, within the constraints of the number of cards for each column. For example, there can only be 10 cards for the neutral column. So it gives you a picture of a person's personality based on 100 personality characteristics or descriptors. I've often been asked, what's the difference between the California Q Set and the California Q Sort? The deck of cards that have these descriptors, these 100 personality descriptions, that is the Q Set. And when a person is asked to do a sort where they have to put the cards into this forced choice distribution to identify the most important all the way to the least important traits in a person, that sorting is called a Q Sort. Here's another example of using the mini-trait approach for a life outcome or behavior. And in this case, we'll use the life outcome of drug abusers. Researchers who have studied the personality characteristics of those who end up being drug abusers have found that drug abuse is often correlated with high extroversion, low agreeableness, and low conscientiousness. So the mini-trait approach was used in this case to identify those traits that are most likely to be associated with a person who abuses drugs. I mentioned school shooters before. There have been several lines of research designed to identify who might be most likely to commit a school shooting. And one of the ways they've done this is using the mini-trait approach. And what they've identified is that school shooters tend to have high levels of anger, low levels of conscientiousness, high levels of hopelessness, vengefulness, and then low levels of extroversion. These are the personality characteristics that are correlated with individuals who are identified as school shooters. That doesn't mean that if you have these personality characteristics that you're going to engage in that kind of behavior, but these are the personality characteristics that are most often associated with people who commit that crime. So I've talked about the single trait approach, the mini-trait approach, and now the essential traits approach in studying traits. Researchers who have studied the essential traits are trying to figure out which traits are the most important traits to describe personality and how many of those traits are there. So the big questions are, which traits are the most important, and how many are there, and is it possible to create a taxonomy of traits? In the question of trying to figure out which traits are the most important, one of the other things researchers are trying to determine is which traits really matter. How many or how few do you need to fully describe an individual so that you're capturing all the important aspects of a person's personality? The number of traits that have been hypothesized as important for being able to capture the essence of a person has been anywhere from 1 to over 100 with the California Q Set. There has been a long history of research that has sought to identify the essential traits of personality using factor analytic methods. Another way researchers have gone about trying to identify the essential traits of personality are using theoretical approaches. So rather than mathematical factor analytic approaches, researchers like Henry Murray, who came up with his needs, these are the important parts of personality, that was based purely on his theory of what personality constructs, in this case needs, are the most important. Hans Eysenck, who we'll talk about when we talk about the anatomy and physiology of personality, came up with 3 personality characteristics that he thought were essential, and he thought you really only needed these 3: psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. And we'll talk about these again when we get to the anatomy and physiology of personality. Tellegen thought that we need 3: positive emotionality, negative emotionality, and constraint. And there have been others, including Wiggins and several other researchers, who have identified different numbers of essential traits using the theoretical approach. Other researchers have used the factor analytic approach, including Eysenck and Tellegen, Cattell, who I'll talk a little bit more about, and others. And other than Cattell, the general consensus of how many traits are needed to capture all the important dimensions of personality all seem to center on the number 5. 5 factors, or 5 broad traits, seems to be what has been identified in study after study that has used factor analysis to determine the most important traits of personality. And I'll talk about those in the next lecture.